Number 3. Mistie Murray. Mistie was born on October 28, 1978, in Nova Scotia, Canada. When she was born, her mother, Darlene Oldfield, was living in poverty and she was struggling with addictions. At the age of 2, Mistie was placed in a therapeutic foster care. After spending a year in foster care, Mistie was adopted by Steve and Anne Murray, who lived in Goderich, Ontario. Goderich is a quiet town that is situated on the shores of Lake Huron. When Mistie was adopted, the town had a population of about 7,300 people. As Mistie entered adolescence, it became apparent that she had learning disabilities and behavioral problems. In 1994, when Mistie was a teenager, she reconnected with her birth mother. They ended up meeting in October 1994. On the weekend of April 2nd, 1995, Mistie, who was 16 years old, planned on going to Halifax, Nova Scotia to meet her birth mother's parents. She was so excited about the trip that she packed her suitcase a week early. On Wednesday, May 31st, 1995, 2 days before she was supposed to fly to Halifax, Mistie attended school. Her father, Steve, dropped her off at school in the morning. During the day, she paid a visit to the school nurse, but it's never been made public why. Mistie called her mother's work at 3 o'clock, but her mother couldn't take the call. Steve and Anne didn't see Mistie on the night of May 31st. The next day, Steve took a business trip to Toronto, and when he arrived home at 8:30 that night, he and Anne realized that Mistie was missing. They started a frantic search for her and called the Goderich police. In turn, the Goderich police called the Ontario Provincial Police, also known as the OPP. After a few days, Mistie had not been found, and the lead investigator with the OPP, Wally Baker, began to suspect that she had been murdered. He even had a suspect. It was Mistie's adopted father, Steve. Baker began to suspect Steve because of something he didn't mention when he was interviewed. Steve had neglected to tell the police that on the evening Mistie went missing, he had taken his boat out on Lake Huron for 20 to 30 minutes. While he was out, he went to a marina and he had the boat washed and waxed. Also, the police found witnesses who thought that they saw Mistie on the docks on the day she went missing. Baker assumed that Steve purposely left out the fact that he took his boat out because he was hiding something. Specifically, he thought that Steve got Mistie onto the boat, took her out on the lake, killed her, and dumped her body. Baker speculated that Steve had been having a sexual relationship with Mistie and he killed her to cover it up. Steve denied having anything to do with Mistie's disappearance. He said he simply forgot that he had taken the boat out. About 4 months after Mistie vanished, Steve was charged with Mistie's murder. The problem was that there was absolutely no evidence that Mistie had been murdered or that Steve had killed her. Baker's theory was that Steve killed Mistie because he had been sexually abusing her. But Baker and several officers were the only ones who believed this. Everyone who knew the family said that Mistie loved her adopted parents and she never had any major complaints about them. Later on, one of the officers who accused Steve of having a sexual relationship with Mistie got arrested for lewd behavior with an underage babysitter. Besides there being a problem with the motive, there were also other plausible suspects. For example, shortly before she disappeared, Mistie told her guidance counselor that she felt threatened by her possessive ex-boyfriend, who was several years older than her. The ex-boyfriend said he saw Mistie for the last time on May 30th. May 31st was the last day her parents saw her, and it was the last day that she attended school. He said he remembered seeing her that day because on the same day he had cashed a check and paid his rent. But the records show that he cashed the check and paid his rent on May 31st, the last day Mistie was seen by her parents. Another group of suspects was the crew of a freighter which had docked in Goderich on May 31st. The police conducted short interviews with the crew, but they went against regulations and didn't keep records of the interviews. Media outlets that were covering Mistie's disappearance pointed out that a member of the crew, who was possibly drunk, could have attacked Mistie. Despite these plausible alternative suspects, Baker and the other officers didn't pay much attention to them. They were sure that Steve had killed Mistie and dumped her body in the lake. But the lake was dragged and searched with sonar, and Mistie's body was not found. Probably the most compelling evidence that Steve didn't kill Mistie was that there were many eyewitnesses who saw Mistie after May 31st. On June 1st, which is the day after her parents last saw her and she last attended school, Mistie was seen at a bargain store in Goderich. The person who saw her was one of her classmates, and they had a conversation in the bargain store. The next day, 3 of her fellow classmates said they drove past Mistie. They said that Mistie was walking towards Clinton, which is a community about 12 miles from Goderich. The 3 students said that they specifically remember that day because they went to the fair in Clinton. That evening, another person who went to school with Mistie saw her in Clinton. The next day, someone who played in the school band with Mistie saw her at the fair in Clinton. She remembered thinking it was odd that Mistie was at the fair because she was supposed to be in Halifax, meeting her biological grandparents. The witness said that Mistie was at the fair with a group of people she didn't know. 2 fair employees also reported seeing someone who matched Mistie's description. But the police never followed up on these sightings. They thought they were all cases of mistaken identity. They didn't think that Mistie would run away because she had been looking forward to going to Halifax. Also, at home, she left behind a suitcase packed with clothes and $200. If she left of her own free will and ran away, why didn't she take her suitcase, which was already packed, or at the very least, take her money with her? The witnesses, on the other hand, were certain that they saw Mistie. They were confident that it was her they saw because they personally knew her. But what confirmed it for them was Mistie's jacket. Mistie owned a distinctive green jacket that had the words Seaforth Girls Trumpet Band and her name embroidered on it. All the witnesses said that she was wearing the jacket when they saw her. These weren't the only people who saw Mistie after she was reported missing. London, Ontario is a city about 60 miles south of Goderich and about 50 miles from Clinton, where Mistie's classmates are sure they saw her after she was reported missing. In the 2 weeks after Mistie was reported missing, 6 different people saw a girl matching her description in London. Some people saw her in a rougher part of the city where there were shelters for street kids. A few people said that it seemed like she was strung out on drugs and she may have been working as a sex worker. After that, there were sightings of Mistie in Toronto, Ontario, which is about 2 hours east of London. Baker and several officers did go to London to search for Mistie, but they found no evidence that she was ever there. Amazingly, despite there being no physical evidence that Steve killed Mistie, he went to trial in May 1997, about 2 years after Mistie went missing. An officer testified, and Steve's lawyer asked him how many sightings were there of Mistie after she was reported missing. The officer said that there were 93 sightings. The people who said they saw Mistie on the docks on the day she went missing also testified. Steve's lawyer pointed out that none of the witnesses knew Mistie, and they just saw a young woman who looked like her. His lawyer was then able to prove that the witnesses were unreliable, or they were too far away from the docks to say with certainty that they saw Mistie. Steve's trial lasted for 13 days. Then the jury deliberated for just 45 minutes. They returned a verdict of not guilty. After the trial, a juror passed a note to Steve's lawyer. The note said that during those 45 minutes, each member of the jury took a bathroom break and 2 people had a smoke break. So while Steve was fortunate to be acquitted, his life was still in shambles. Not only was his daughter still missing, but the cost of the defense ruined him financially. Before Mistie went missing, he owned a popular pub in Godrich. He also owned a Trans Am and a speedboat. But he had to sell it all to pay for his defense. Since the police suspected Steve killed Mistie on his boat, they tore it apart looking for clues. When they didn't find any evidence on the boat, they returned the boat to him in pieces, and it was sold for less than half the value that it was when it was confiscated by the police. Some people suspected that Baker, the lead investigator on the case, was jealous of Steve. Steve was a popular man around town who was considered handsome. He ran a successful bar, and he owned a nice car and boat. Anne never thought that Steve was involved in Mistie's disappearance. Nevertheless, they got divorced after Mistie disappeared. A year after the trial, Wally Baker was interviewed, and he was still adamant that Steve had killed Mistie. He said that he had spent the year looking for the best sonar equipment to look underwater. More searches of Lake Huron were conducted at the taxpayers' expense, but no trace of Mistie was ever found. The rest of the OPP wasn't helpful either. In May 1998, a year after Steve's trial, Anne filed a complaint against the investigators who worked on the case. An officer with the OPP got in touch with her and told her if she dropped the complaint, he would give her the last letter that Mistie ever wrote to her and Steve. Anne knew about the letter because it was read aloud in court. In it, Mistie says she is sorry for being a difficult daughter. She asks for forgiveness and she thanks them. She also wrote that if she were them, she would have given up on her a long time ago. She signs off the letter by saying she will always be their daughter. The OPP conducted a review of the investigation, and they said that the officers made errors, but they did not commit misconduct. The Ontario Civilian Commission on Police Service then performed an audit of the investigation. They told Anne that her complaint raised serious issues which the Commission wishes to have further examined. But if those issues were examined, the results were never made public. After Anne and Steve divorced, Anne continued to follow up on sightings of Mistie. There was a promising sighting from Vancouver, British Columbia, but it turned out that the young woman wasn't Mistie. Anne stopped looking for Mistie in 2001 so she could focus her attention on raising her 2 sons. Steve moved 275 miles away from Goderich to Callander, Ontario. He worked as a trucker. On the back of his tractor trailer, he affixed Mistie's missing persons poster. On July 30th, 2018, Steve Murray died at the age of 68 in a workplace accident. 24 years later, it's still not known what happened to Mistie Murray. Many people believe she got lost in the world of drugs and prostitution. Mistie's adopted mother, Anne, is one of the people who believes this. She said, in hindsight, Mistie probably had attachment disorder. The disorder is found in people who were profoundly neglected as children. Part of the disorder is forming indiscriminate relationships. If Mistie did have attachment disorder, it would have been very easy for her to get mixed up with the wrong crowd. Some people believe that in the years after Mistie disappeared, she died as a result of her new lifestyle. Other people think she is still alive, if possibly using an alias. If Mistie Murray is still alive, at the time of this video, she would be 42 years old. Number 2. Paul Armstrong, Stephen Lombard, and Karen Wright. In December 1993, 28-year-old Paul Armstrong in Merced, California, had a broken leg and he was using crutches. Despite his injury, he continued to work as a tow truck driver for RTS Towing, which was also located in Merced. On the morning of December 17, 1993, he said goodbye to his girlfriend and he left his home to go to work. About an hour later, Armstrong's brother stopped by his home. His brother went inside and found no one home. But he did find Armstrong's wallet inside the home. Armstrong was supposed to meet his girlfriend for lunch, but he didn't show up. He also didn't come home that evening. On that same morning, about 2 hours after Armstrong left for work, 34-year-old Stephen Lombard arrived at RTS Towing to pick up his paycheck. Like Armstrong, Lombard was a tow truck driver. Lombard planned on doing some Christmas shopping, and then he was going to meet up with his wife. But there was supposedly a clerical error, and his paycheck wasn't ready. Apparently, after he couldn't get his paycheck, Lombard left the tow yard. But he did not meet up with his wife, and he did not return home. Armstrong and Lombard were both reported missing. While both men were co-workers, they weren't friends, so their families didn't think that they would go anywhere together. Shortly after they disappeared, Lombard's pickup truck, a Ford F-250, which he drove to the tow yard on the day that he disappeared, was found abandoned in a Kmart parking lot. The doors were unlocked, the keys were inside, and the windows were rolled down. Lombard's family thought that this was odd because he always locked his truck. The truck was the only trace of either man that was found after the morning of December 17th. The police thought the disappearances were suspicious, and they investigated the disappearances as a double homicide. Unfortunately, they did not find any concrete leads, and it wasn't long before the cases went cold. Then, just over 15 years later, another person connected to RTS Towing mysteriously disappeared. On February 12, 2009, the owner of RTS Towing, 59-year-old Randall Wright, called the Sheriff's Department in Merced. He told them that he thought that someone had broken into his home. Sheriff's deputies went to his home to write a report. When they got there, Randall mentioned that his wife of 12 years, 50-year-old Karen Wright, was supposed to return from Mexico, but she never did. Randall explained that they had a vacation home in San Felipe, Mexico. Randall said that he talked to Karen on February 9th, which was 3 days earlier, but he had not heard from her since. The sheriff's office got in contact with Karen's family, and the last time they talked to her was also on February 9th. She had called them from the vacation home in San Felipe. The sheriff's office thought that Karen's lack of communication was worth sending deputies to San Felipe to investigate. The deputies who were sent to San Felipe were surprised to learn that Randall didn't file a missing persons report with the local police. The sheriff's office also learned that Randall and Karen's relationship was nearing its end. Several months earlier, in October 2008, Karen had filed for divorce. In the court documents, Karen alleged that Randall was abusive. She claimed that he had ripped chunks out of her hair and he had broken her hand. He had also threatened to kill her several times. He supposedly told her that he could murder her and nobody would know. Karen also alleged that Randall talked about how he joined a motorcycle club, and if she divorced him, then the motorcycle club would kill her so that he wouldn't have any blood on his hands. After Karen filed for divorce, there was a ruling that no construction work could be done on the vacation house. Just before Karen disappeared, Randall was staying at the vacation house, and Karen suspected that he was doing work on the house. She decided to travel there to make sure he wasn't doing anything to the house. The sheriff's office thought that this was all very suspicious, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge Randall with Karen's murder. After all, they didn't even know where Karen's body was, so they would have had a hard enough time proving she was dead, let alone that Randall killed her. The police kept looking into Randall's background, and they found yet another tragedy connected to him. 27 years before Karen went missing, on July 9, 1982, Randall was alone watching his 6-year-old stepson, Aaron Wright. Aaron was the son of Randall's wife that he had been married to before he married Karen. While Randall was supervising him, Aaron sadly drowned in a neighbor's pool. At the time, the police had no reason to suspect foul play. But after 3 people connected to Randall disappeared under mysterious circumstances, the sheriff's office had Aaron's body exhumed. An autopsy was performed, but no evidence of foul play was found. After Karen vanished, the sheriff's office started to re-examine the disappearances of Paul Armstrong and Stephen Lombard. A sheriff's detective talked to another RTS towing employee who was at the tow yard on the day the 2 men went missing. He said that Armstrong and Lombard went into a shed that was on the tow yard property with Randall and another man named Gary Barker. He said that Randall locked the door behind them. A short time later, Randall and Barker came out of the shed, but Armstrong and Lombard never did. Then Randall drove his Lexus into the shed and closed the door behind him. He drove out of the shed a short time later and drove away from the tow yard. Then Barker got into Lombard's pickup truck and drove it off the tow yard. The witness said that after Armstrong and Lombard went into the shed, he never saw them again. While this sounded highly suspicious, the police didn't have any solid evidence that Armstrong and Lombard were dead, or any evidence that Randall killed them. Then in March 2009, Randall Wright was arrested. But he wasn't arrested for murder. Instead, he was charged with filing a false stolen vehicle report. Randall had been leasing a Mercedes-Benz G55 since April 2007. But then he stopped making payments on it, and the dealership repossessed it in December 2008. Then shortly after it was repossessed, it went missing from the dealership's lot. The car was found a few months later in San Felipe in the possession of Randall's girlfriend. In August 2009, Randall pleaded no contest to filing a false stolen vehicle report, and he was sentenced to 6 months in jail. Randall Wright has never been named a suspect in the disappearances of his employees, Paul Armstrong and Stephen Lombard, and his wife, Karen Wright. However, he has been identified as a person of interest in Karen's disappearance. It's also unclear if Randall had anything to do with the death of his stepson, or if it was just a tragic accident. The police think that Randall Wright is either incredibly unlucky, or he's a cold-blooded killer who is getting away with 4 murders. Number 1. Heather Teague. The Ohio River separates southern Indiana from northern Kentucky. In the mid-1990s, a man named Tim Waldhall lived in a house on the shore of the river in Newburgh, Indiana. At about 12:45 p.m. on August 26, 1995, Waldhall was using a telescope, and he was watching the beach on the other side of the river, which was located in Henderson County, Kentucky. He noticed a young woman who was sunbathing alone on the beach. Then he saw something really odd. He watched as a man crept through some brush behind her. Then he leapt out, grabbed the woman by her hair, and pointed a gun at her. He then dragged her into the wooded area that was behind them. Waldhall was disturbed by what he saw, so he called 911. The problem was that he was in Indiana, and the crime he witnessed happened in Kentucky, so he had to get the phone number for the police department in Henderson County. The police in Henderson did not arrive on the scene until about 26 minutes after Waldhall saw the kidnapping. By the time the police got there, the woman and her attacker were no longer there. They only found her towel, her notebook, $7, and pieces of a swimsuit. Later that day, 23-year-old Heather Teague of Henderson County was reported missing. The last time anyone talked to her, she said she was going to do some sunbathing on the beach. The police concluded that Heather was the woman who was abducted. Search dogs were brought in, and they tracked her scent to an area where people parked their cars when they visited the beach. The police thought that after she was dragged off the beach, she was loaded into a vehicle. It turned out, around the time that Heather went missing, farmers in the area were having problems with rowdy beachgoers. So the farmers had been paying people who lived near the beach to videotape cars that came and went from the parking area. The police found someone who had recorded Heather's car arriving that morning. Then later, a red and white Ford Bronco was videotaped driving by her car. 4 days after Heather disappeared, the police brought in Tim Waldhall, who witnessed the abduction. He described the kidnapper to a police sketch artist. Waldhall said that the man was around 6 feet tall, and he weighed about 210 to 230 pounds. He said he had long brown hair and a bushy brown beard. He was shirtless, and he was wearing jeans. The next day, the police went to question a suspect. His name was Marty Dill, and he lived in Lombard, Kentucky, which wasn't far from the beach. Dill had a criminal record. In February 1995, about 6 months before Heather was kidnapped, Dill was arrested in Evansville, Indiana. He had been driving around in his red and white Ford Bronco and harassing young girls. The police searched his vehicle and they found marijuana, rubber gloves, duct tape, rope, and 2 loaded guns. Dill had been released from jail a few weeks before Heather Teague was kidnapped. Dill lived with his wife and young son in a mobile home on Dill's family's 28-acre property. Dill became aware that the police were on the property and he told his wife to get out of the home. She did as she was told and she got out. Dill then supposedly shot himself and he died from his gunshot wound. After Dill's death, the police searched his property. They found a red and white Ford Bronco. It was hidden in some brush on the property. The FBI got involved in the investigation and they examined Dill's Bronco. The inside of the Bronco had been cleaned, but they found 2 spots of blood and a towel with strands of hair on it. The FBI did DNA tests on the blood and they determined that one of the spots did not belong to Heather. The other spot of blood was too small to create a profile and they don't know whose blood it was. In November 1995, there was a grand jury hearing where all the evidence against Dill was presented. Dill's wife was forced to testify. She pleaded the fifth to every question she was asked. After the grand jury session, the case sat in limbo. The police were sure that Dill kidnapped and killed Heather, and his suicide solidified that theory. Unfortunately, with their prime suspect dead, they had no idea where Heather's body might be. Heather's mother, Sarah Teague, looked for her daughter's body on her own. One time, she found some bones in the basement of an abandoned house. She called the police and they had the bones examined. It turned out that they were the bones of a goat. In the years since Heather's disappearance, Sarah started to notice that there were problems with the case against Marty Dill. It started when Dill's mother sent her a photograph of her son on the day he was released from jail. In the photograph, he is bald and he is clean shaven. The photo was taken a few weeks before the kidnapping. The jail records also said that Dill was bald and beardless when he left the jail. Dill's mother told Sarah in the days before Heather was kidnapped, he was still bald and clean shaven. Several of Dill's other family members and his friends said the same thing. But Tim Waldhall, who witnessed the abduction, described the kidnapper as a man with long brown hair and a bushy brown beard. What Sarah thought was interesting was that Waldhall talked to the police sketch artist after the police saw the video of the red and white Bronco driving past Heather's car. The police knew that Dill had a red and white Bronco, and for this reason, they already suspected him before Waldhall talked to the sketch artist. Sarah also noted that the sketch of the kidnapper looked a lot like Dill's 1994 driver's license photo. Sarah even noticed that there was a shadow in the same place on the sketch as there was in the driver's license photo. Sarah then began to wonder if Marty Dill was the man who kidnapped her daughter, or if he was just a convenient suspect. But if Dill didn't kidnap Heather, then why did he shoot himself when the police went to question him? Friends and family of Dill said that he had a marijuana patch, and he did not want to go back to jail, so he chose death instead. One major problem with the theory that Dill wasn't the kidnapper was some evidence that was found in the front seat of the Bronco. It was the strands of hair that were on the towel that was on the front seat. In March 2009, Sarah Teague said she received a report from the FBI, and it said that the hair was tested for DNA. The hairs belonged to Heather. Despite this, Sarah still doesn't think that Dill was the kidnapper. Instead, she thought that another man might have committed the kidnapping. In August 2002, a detective in Medina, Ohio, was tracking a possible serial killer named Christopher Below. He started looking for other possible victims in Kentucky and Indiana, and he thought that Heather Teague may have been one. The detective first got on the trail of Below while he was investigating the disappearance of a 26-year-old Medina woman named Catherine Fetzer. Below and Fetzer met while they were temporary employees at a spray paint manufacturing plant in Medina. In the summer of 1991, Fetzer started cheating on her husband of 5 years with Below. Below was also married. In fact, he was on his third wife. On November 26, 1991, Fetzer left a note for her husband on their fridge. She wrote that she was restless and she was going to the mall. Sadly, she didn't come home that night. The next day, her car was found abandoned about 20 miles from her home. But beyond that, there was no trace of Fetzer. After she disappeared, her husband found love letters written by Below. Below was questioned, but he said he didn't know where Fetzer was. 3 years later, in the summer of 1994, a year before Heather Teague disappeared, Below moved to Henderson County, Kentucky. 11 months later, he moved to Georgia with his fourth wife. Within 2 weeks after he moved to Georgia, he moved back to Henderson County. Just weeks after he moved back to Henderson, Heather vanished. Below and Heather shared several friends. Heather and Catherine Fetzer also shared similar qualities. They were both petite brunettes who were close in age. The detective who was working on Fetzer's case thought that Fetzer and Heather looked like sisters. Something else that caught the attention of the detective was the sketch drawn from Tim Walthall's description of the kidnapper. The sketch had a striking resemblance to Below. In fact, Walthall was asked to identify the kidnapper in 2 different photo lineups. Both photo lineups included a photo of Below. Both times, Walthall identified Below as the kidnapper. 5 days after Heather disappeared, Below packed up and moved back to Georgia. He moved on the same day that Marty Dill supposedly shot himself. Interestingly, Dill and Below also shared some friends. This has led to speculation that Dill and Below committed the abduction together. This would explain the inconsistencies in the case against Dill. Walthall said that the man who grabbed Heather had long hair and a bushy beard. But at the time of the kidnapping, Dill had a shaved head and he had no beard. So it's possible that Below did the kidnapping and Dill drove the Bronco. This would explain how Heather's hair got into the Bronco. Then Below skipped town when he heard Dill killed himself, possibly because he was worried about what the police might find. After Heather disappeared, Below continued to live in Georgia, where he worked as a truck driver. He often made trips to North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and Alabama. On the night of May 5, 1998, Below was in St. Cloud, Florida. That was the same night that 43-year-old Mary Cousteau vanished after getting into a fight with her boyfriend at a local bar. could show had similar physical features to Heather and Fetzer. Below is also believed to be responsible for a couple of disappearances before he moved to Henderson County. On August 8, 1994, a year before Heather Teague vanished, 18-year-old Shailene Farrell left her family's home in Pequot, Ohio. She told her family she was driving to a nearby store to buy a drink. She did not return home or show up for work that night, so her family reported her missing. The car she was driving was discovered abandoned in a parking lot on the same day she disappeared. At the time, Below was living in Lodi, Ohio, and he was working as a truck driver. Pequot is about 150 miles from Lodi, and Below may have been in the area when Farrell went missing. Then finally, there's the disappearance of 16-year-old Christina Porco, who went missing nearly 5 years to the day of Fetzer's disappearance. Christina lived on Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. On the night of November 29, 1986, Christina got into a fight with her mother, and she stormed out of the condo where her family lived. She called one of her friends from a payphone and asked if she could spend the night, but her friend's mother said no. Christina told her friend she was going to sleep in the condo complex's pool area. The next day, Christina's sweater was found in the pool area, but Christina was nowhere to be found. No one has seen her or heard from her since. Christina's physical profile is very similar to Below's other supposed victims. Also, Below was living in South Carolina when Christina disappeared. But something else tied him to Christina's disappearance. After Below abandoned his apartment in Lodi, the police searched it. They found a briefcase, and inside of it, there was a single piece of paper. It was Christina's missing persons flyer. In 2003, the detective in Medina received several tips from Below's friends and family regarding the disappearance of Catherine Fetzer. The detective decided to interview Below again. He offered Below a deal where he could plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter for the disappearance of Catherine Fetzer. If he took the plea deal, he would avoid getting a life sentence. Below agreed to take the plea deal. He said that he shot Fetzer. He claimed she played games with his head and he got sick of it. He told the detective that they would never find her body. He said he put it in a trash can. In November 2003, Below was sentenced to 11 to 18 years in prison. At the time of this video, he is incarcerated at the Grafton Correctional Institution in Grafton, Ohio. He has been questioned about the disappearances of the other women, but he has never been charged. He is considered a person of interest in all 4 unsolved disappearances. There is one other theory regarding the disappearance of Heather Teague. Heather's mother, Sarah, is suspicious of the Kentucky State Police, known as the KSP. They were the police force that handled the investigation, and she thinks they may have committed a cover-up. In March 2008, the KSP allowed Sarah and her lawyer to listen to a recording of Tim Walthall's 911 call. In the call, Walthall describes the kidnapper as having long hair and a bushy beard, and he may have been wearing mosquito netting or a wig. Sarah and her lawyer also noted that the 911 dispatcher was female. Then in February 2016, Sarah and her lawyer were granted permission to listen to the 911 call again. They immediately noticed that this one was different from the one they listened to 8 years earlier. It was still Walthall's voice, but the content was different. Notably, in the second recording, Walthall leaves out the description of the kidnapper. Also, the dispatcher in the second recording was male. The KSB denied that there was more than one recording of the 911 call. They said that the recording of the call that Sarah and her lawyer heard in 2016 was the same one they heard in 2008. Sarah and her lawyer are convinced that there are two different recordings. They think that after the initial call, the police convinced Walthall to record a second one to build a stronger case against Marty Dill. Either the first one they heard in March 2008 was the fake one, and the police got Walthall to describe Dill based on his 1994 driver's license photo. Or the second call, which they listened to in March 2016, could have been the fake one. In the second recording, there is no description of the kidnapper. This could have been recorded when the police realized that Dill was bald and clean-shaven. Something else that was odd about the investigation was the Ford Bronco. The Bronco had been cleaned, but yet, a towel with strands of Heather's hair on it was left in the front seat. Why would Dill go to all the work to clean up the other forensic evidence and dispose of the body in a way that it has been found in decades, but then leave a towel with Heather's hairs on it in the front seat of the Bronco? In May 2016, Sarah's lawyers sanctioned the KSP to release Marty Dill's mugshots, recordings of both 911 calls, and a record of who accessed the 911 calls. The KSP flat out refused to give them what they wanted, despite the fact that the information should have been released under the Freedom of Information Act. So Sarah's lawyer filed a lawsuit against the KSP. In January 2018, Sarah won her lawsuit, and the KSP was ordered to release all the information that she had requested. The KSP were also ordered to pay Sarah nearly $24,000 for her legal fees. The KSP appealed the ruling. In February 2019, the Kentucky Court of Appeals upheld the ruling. They said that the KSP lacked plausible justification for withholding the documents and acted in a conscious disregard to Sarah's right to access the information. If the information that Sarah sued to get released was handed over to her, she has not made that information public. A major question is, why would the police want to cover up the disappearance of a 23-year-old woman? Sarah found a possible explanation in the FBI's files on the case. They thought that Heather's disappearance was possibly linked to drugs, prostitution, and public corruption in Henderson County. So Heather may have been killed to silence her, and then the crime was pinned on Marty Dill. Something worth noting is that the FBI's file on the case said that Dill allegedly died by suicide. This suggests that they aren't entirely convinced that Dill shot himself. If there was a cover-up and Dill was set up to take the fall, his death would have been beneficial to the people who did the cover-up. His death ensured that there was no trial where the case could be examined more thoroughly. He was also not able to proclaim his innocence or say he was set up. Instead, Dill's death actually made him look guilty, and it effectively closed the case. Had Sarah not begun investigating the disappearance of her daughter, people would have just gone on assuming that Dill was the one who kidnapped her. Sarah also thinks that a police cover-up explains why Dill's girlfriend pleaded the fifth when she testified at the grand jury. Sarah thought she could have been threatened, or at the very least she was too scared to say anything. This would have been especially true if she knew that Dill didn't take his own life, but instead he was murdered. Something else that bothered Sarah is that the KSP never seemed to cooperate with her. Besides not giving her the recordings of the 911 calls and Dill's mugshots, they wouldn't search areas where Heather's body might be hidden. They wouldn't even search Dill's family's property, which has a pond. However, this is mostly speculation, and the Kentucky State Police and officials in Henderson County have adamantly denied that there was a cover-up, and they have said that there is no corruption in Henderson County. Sarah Teague still holds out hope that her daughter, Heather, is still alive, and one day she'll come back home. If Heather Teague is still alive, she would be 47 at the time of this video. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. Well, that's all for today. Thank you again for watching.